Back to Razmafsar TV. I am really happy today to present a very good martial artist, and I have been in contact with John Clements for a couple of years. And first of all, let me welcome John. Hi, John, and welcome to Razmafsar TV channel.
Greetings. A pleasure and an honor to be here.
Thank you very much. Okay, John Clements, for those of you, because in our channel is mostly visited by Kyokushinkai, Muay Thai, MMA, and wrestlers. That's the reason I need to make more introduction who John Clements is. John Clements is the pioneer of European martial arts. I mean, reviving European martial arts. And I remember back then, okay, I come from, of course, as many of you know, wrestling and Kyokushin background. Back then, I think I was, I ordered his two books. One was on medieval swordsmanship, one was on Renaissance swordsmanship, and I bought his books. And then through different events, John and I have had contact and exchanged emails and communication. Let me just give the floor to John to present himself, because he's going to be a better job than I do. Okay, John, please introduce yourself about your martial arts background and who you are. Thank you.
My name is John Clements. I am director of ARMA, the Association for Renaissance Martial Arts. I have been its director since 2000. Prior to that, the organization was called HACA, and I took it over in 1995. My website has been online since about 1996. I've been a pioneer and a promoter of study of historical fencing, historical European martial arts, or Renaissance martial arts for a long time. I am the sole proprietor of Iron Door School of Arms, which is my fight school. And I am a professional fight master and a fight consultant. And I do work for the video game industry and for the entertainment industry, a lot of which I can't talk about because of NDAs, unfortunately. And I have taught in around 17 or 18 countries around the world, and written a lot of articles, both for the general audience and general public, as well as to educate practitioners and enthusiasts of this subject. And I also have written a lot of scholarly articles, and I've given presentations and lectures at museums and universities around the world. And this is what I do. I'm kind of obsessed with swords. My specialty is Renaissance martial arts. I make the distinction between medieval. The vast majority of the original source material practice is Renaissance. It's not medieval. And there is a cultural and a social, and sometime back in the mid-90s, I started to realize that this subject of reconstructing, reconstituting, recovering, reclaiming, rebuilding the martial arts of Renaissance Europe required that we study exclusively the source material from the original masters of defense, and that we approach it as a legitimate self-defense method or combative. And that meant using realistic weaponry. That meant practicing target cutting with sharp blades. It meant lots of sparring. It meant investigating it in terms of how they actually trained and practiced, and to not sportify it, to turn it into a competitive game, to role play it with costumes, to make it about pageantry and spectacle, but to exclusively follow the model that was set up in the late 19th century by some British antiquarians, Egerton Castle and Alfred Hutton primarily, who started doing this originally. They started to look at the source material, get replica weapons and antique weapons, and reproduce these methods and see how it was different from 19th century fencing methods, from the sport fencing that was being created. They did that, and unfortunately, their approach died out, probably died out as a result of World War I and all the calamity that caused.
And then with the development of sports fencing in the 20th century as an international Olympic activity, that changed it. So we went back to their model and we adopted it. And when I came into this field, there was literally nobody doing that. Maybe a few people were dabbling in it, but most everybody was doing reenactment, living history. They were doing costumed, dressing up and setting up camps and pretending to fight, or they were creating their own sportified versions of it that were not based upon the reality of the actual self-defense skills. So what I did was say, well, I'm only going to focus on the source material. I'm only going to focus on how the real arms and armor function and explore it from that point of view. So we set up a website around 96. We put manuals online, and I started a worldwide effort to hunt down these works. Well, I didn't start it, I joined it. And in the process, I set up a bunch of standardized drills and exercises and an entire approach that was adopted by a lot of different people. So that now I've been doing this professionally as a fight master for 21 years. I've taught in 17 or 18 countries. I've been in numerous television documentaries and hosted a combat show 2 years ago. I wrote some books in the 90s, but they were actually in print up until 2 years ago. And in the meantime, I contributed articles, academic articles and scholarly articles to half a dozen different journals. I had about 7 or 8 students who went on to write their own books. I've written introductions to another 10 books or so, and I've contributed to a bunch of different symposia and conferences, and traveled around the world demonstrating and lecturing at universities and museums and various places. So this is what I do. I have a facility here outside Atlanta, Georgia, Iron Door Studio, the first of its kind in the world, which is rather sad when you think about how many Asian martial arts schools exist and how common sport fencing is. But I built it on my own property, so it is what we call a private school of defense, which was actually the name of a fencing work from 1614. By private school, it's not a public school. I don't have to have people that come in the door and I have to accept them. I screen my students. I keep my student base small. The lessons are very personal, very one-on-one, one-on-two, one-on-three. And I have students that travel from all around the state. Some of them come monthly. Some of them come every couple of months. Some of them come weekly. In the last couple of years, I have not traveled as much or done the gatherings and the seminars and workshops that I pioneered because I've been focused on my own research and writing. To conclude, I would say that when I started doing this 20 years ago, we were scrounging for material. We were desperate for these works. We were desperate for their translations. Now we're drowning in the works. We're drowning in translations, some of them inaccurate, some of them questionable, some of them very useful. And we're drowning in interpretations, some of which are just asinine, other ones are brilliant. And it's difficult to wade through all this. And I have been offering through my private organization's private website, we've been offering a training program online now since 2001. It's behind a paywall. And I've found in the last 15 years of having done this professionally in this fight school, surrounded by this equipment and these training devices and all this information, my own personal curricula has changed from what I'm able to offer my members privately. And then what I offer the public in terms of education and information has also changed. And it's, I consider it a journey, a process, and it's very challenging and it's very different than what a lot of other people are doing out there. To conclude, I have a different perspective than a lot of other people because A, I do this professionally. I'm doing this for a living. It puts food on my table and shoes on my child's feet. So I don't give away my material. I get compensated for my instruction. And I don't give away my lesson plans and my curriculum. And I have a proprietary approach to the drills and exercises and interpretations that I create, because just as any professional, I deserve compensation for what I've done, rather than having it stolen or copied or borrowed without recognition or attribution by people who then go into competition with me and at the same time are criticizing me, and yet they don't have my experience, my resources, or my obligations to my students and constituent members. So I have a different approach. And my approach comes from having handled hundreds of real weapons and having sparred around North America and around and why I do it.
Okay, very good, John. Could you please explain to our viewers, I mean, I know there are so many different weapons in European tradition, but just a major classification of swords. Let's start with swords. Could you tell our viewers how many different types of, major types, right, of European swords exist, so they have an idea, please?
Okay. When it comes to the Renaissance, which is Western Europe, from about 1350 to about 1650, it's my opinion that in that 300-year period, we saw actually the greatest diversity and variety of weaponry and armor in human history in that small section of the world. Because you have weapons for battlefield use. Then, because of firearms, they transitioned towards weaponry for civilian use, for urban use, and for personal duel. So we have these two different things coming together, or rather separating, military weapons and civilian weapons. So it's probably easier if I show rather than just talk. So give me a moment. All right, so this is a single-hand medieval sword. It is called an arming sword because it's a weapon you would be armed with. You would essentially wear it on your side. So military weapon, no distinction between military and civilian weaponry. Single-hand, double-edged, straight-bladed. Curved point, can deal with a lot of different armors. At the same time, you might see a weapon like this, which is single-edged, curved on the point, curved on the back, has a short edge and a long edge, and it can have any kind of hilt on it. And this comes in a lot of different varieties. And it goes all the way back to the Greeks and to Asia Minor, and you see this type of weapon around the world. So this was as common as this, and it came in as many varieties. It doesn't deal with armor as well. It's not as good for horseback, some people believe. It's not as good for fighting against a large shield, some people will argue. We don't really know. Then you have the long swords. And this particular long sword, as you can see, tapers. So because it tapers, it doesn't have the mass and the width here to deliver very powerful cuts. But it's very, very good on thrusting. So it can get into armor and can hit the armor where you need to hit the armor. But there's all sorts of different versions of this. And there are two-hand versions of these. And there are two-hand versions of these. And there are single-hand versions of these. So we have a huge variety. And then you might have something like this, where this blade is not all that different from this blade. The blades are very similar. I was talking about how there are a number of military swords in the Renaissance that are cut and thrust swords of various types. They can be wide, they can be slender, they can be short, they can be long. And we see that with these swords, they start to have more of them with a knuckle guard and with a side ring and with a finger ring, or rather finger ring, side rings. And they'll do different things to the hilts. But this blade itself is not all that different than earlier blades. And these hilts can be found on earlier swords. But into the 16th century, you'll get a lot more of those. And this type of weapon is sometimes called a spada de lato, or side sword, or a field sword, or a 16th century arming sword, or a cut and thrust sword. It has a lot of different names. Some people will call it an early rapier. I don't like calling it an early rapier because when the term rapier comes about, although it can apply to some of these were also just being called spada, sword. And you'll see a weapon like this, which has a blade very similar, but this is one which you would say, yes, that's a rapier. No doubt about it that that's a rapier. And yet it's very hard to distinguish between them. It's, to use an analogy, if I said to you, everybody bring your car tomorrow, then we know what we mean by car. All right, but you might have a sports car and I might have an SUV and someone else might have a minivan or a truck, and they're all cars. So unless we specify which type of car, it's that way. This is a sword. There's no doubt it's a sword, but what kind of sword? And then from this style, which is still a military cut and thrust blade, but more and more it's being used for civilian dueling and urban self-defense. And it's not going up against armor. It's not going up against two-handed weapons. It's not going up against pikes and halberds as much. And finally, in about, the 1570s, the 1580s, these start to become prevalent, where the blade is very slender, very long, and it has a different cross-section. And it's not capable of doing cuts, or at least cuts that are going to dismember or that will be lethal. It's designed for unarmored dueling and street fighting. And this is a weapon in which the masters of defense start to study in a different way than they studied the earlier ones. There's a big emphasis on geometry, and there's a big emphasis on just fighting with this alone. Not with a dagger, not with a cloak, not with a buckler, and not going up against other weapons, but only fighting another one of these. So that is one branch of swords and how it reflects the development of fencing, the development of the dueling culture, the changing military technology, the firearms doing away with armor. At first, the firearms help perfect armor, plate armor, but then it does away with it. And then eventually you go from this to the gentleman's small sword, which is a junior version of this. And that's where you get modern sport fencing from.
Okay.
And that is the most condensed short version I can give.
Thank you, John. Because, you know, when you were in another place, in your fencing hall, in your training hall, the voice was not very good. I would really appreciate, could you show us the first sword again? You showed us before, the first one. The first one you showed. Could you show it again?
Yes, but I have to go and get it.
Yes,